The radio crackled once, weak, broken, then fell silent, just as a hand pressed faintly against shattered glass, leaving a thin streak of blood that slid and vanished. Raymond was out of the truck before thought could catch him, while Max pulled hard, breath ragged, eyes locked on the officer trapped inside, pinned where the fire was about to reach. Then Raymond saw what didn't belong, a wire cut clean through, blood where there shouldn't have been any, footprints leading away, not toward help. His chest tightened as an old memory surfaced, brief and unwanted, of a night long ago when someone had been left behind because the signs were missed. Max, don't let go. Because as the engine hissed and the air turned sharp with fuel, Raymond understood the truth. The crash wasn't the real danger. It was a signal. And the question was no longer who needed saving, but why someone wanted to be found so badly. Before we begin, hit like, share this video, and subscribe. And really, I'm curious. Where are you watching from? Drop your country name in the comments. I love seeing how far our stories travel. The sound came first. Wrong in its shape, wrong in its ending. Not thunder, not the long roll of impact Raymond had learned to recognize over decades of night roads, but something sharper, more final. Metal folding against itself with a violence that ended too quickly, followed by a silence so complete it felt deliberate, as if the road itself had chosen to stop breathing. Raymond's foot eased off the accelerator before his mind had finished catching up, a reflex carved deep into muscle memory rather than thought. Max reacted before anything else could. The German Shepherd's head lifted from the passenger seat, ears snapping forward, body going rigid in a way that had nothing to do with curiosity and everything to do with warning. His coat, dark sable brushed with black along the spine, caught the dashboard glow as he leaned toward the windshield, nostrils flaring. For one suspended second, dog and man were both still, listening to the echo of something already gone. Then a low growl rolled out of Max's chest, not loud, not frantic, but edged with certainty. Raymond slowed to a stop without fully realizing he had done it. His hand hovered near the radio, thumb brushing the cracked plastic out of habit, the way it always did when the night shifted unexpectedly. Before he could form a question in his own mind, Max pawed at the door with controlled urgency, claws clicking once against metal. I didn't panic. It was insistence. The kind that came from knowing there was no time to negotiate. They found the wreck less than a mile down the road, tucked into a shallow ditch that ran parallel to the asphalt, like an afterthought. A patrol SUV lay upside down, its undercarriage exposed, wheels still spinning slowly, as if confused about which way gravity now pointed. Smoke whispered from beneath the hood in thin gray ribbons, curling into the fog that clung low to the ground. One headlight remained lit, unblinking, casting a lonely triangular beam across wet grass and broken glass. A cone of light that felt more like a signal than an accident. Raymond killed the engine and stepped out, boots sinking slightly into the soft shoulder. The cold bit through his jacket, sharp and immediate, but he barely noticed. His attention locked onto the vehicle, on the unnatural angle of its frame, on the way the fog swallowed everything beyond that narrow slice of light. Max was already moving, leash slack as he pulled forward, nose low, tail stiff. Raymond followed, sliding down the embankment with a care that suggested old injuries and older habits, one hand steadying himself against the slope. The closer they got, the heavier the air felt. Gasoline hung beneath the smoke, sweet and dangerous, threading itself into Raymond's breath. He moved around the vehicle's rear, eyes scanning for movement, for any sign that this was already over. Max circled to the shattered driver's side window, glass crunching softly beneath his paws. He barked once, short, sharp, then darted forward, pressing his muzzle through the jagged opening. Inside the overturned cabin, a young officer was pinned hard against the steering wheel, his body twisted unnaturally by the restraints meant to save him. Blood seeped from his temple, dark against pale skin, running in slow lines that defied the inverted gravity of the scene. His uniform was rumpled, stained, the badge on his chest dulled by soot and road grime. One hand hung limp, fingers brushing the ceiling that was now the floor, trembling faintly with shallow breaths that barely fogged the glass. Raymond reached for the door handle, braced his shoulder, and pushed. The metal didn't give. He adjusted his footing, tried again, muscles tightening, jaw clenching, as the frame groaned but held. Somewhere inside the engine compartment, something hissed softly, a sound too steady to ignore. Max shifted closer to the officer's torso, eyes bright, focused, waiting. Raymond dropped lower, forcing air into his lungs, and made a decision that felt less like a command and more like an agreement formed long ago. "Max, pull!" The words came out steady, stripped of urgency by trust. Max didn't hesitate. He clamped his jaws around the torn strap of the officer's vest, teeth anchoring into fabric and gear, hind legs digging into the dirt for leverage. His body leaned back with everything he had, muscles standing out beneath his thick coat as he pulled in short, powerful bursts. Raymond pressed his shoulder against the frame again, this time not fighting it, but working with it, timing his effort to the rhythm of Max's strain. Metal protested, the sound deep and aching, as if the vehicle itself understood what was being taken from it. The air grew thicker, gasoline sharper, burning the back of Raymond's throat. Sweat ran cold down his spine despite the chill. Then came the sound that changed everything, the unmistakable rip of fabric tearing under pressure. The strap gave way with a final snap, and the officer's body slid free, weight collapsing forward into Raymond's arms. For a brief, breathless moment, the world narrowed to the feel of another human being alive against his chest, the thud of a heart still fighting to keep time. A spark flared beneath the hood, small but violent, lighting the smoke from within. Raymond didn't look back. He shifted the officer's weight, turned, and moved uphill with Max close at his side, the dog glancing once over his shoulder, ears flattening as the danger behind them grew impatient. They barely cleared the ditch when the explosion came, a concussive roar that shoved heat and sound into the night, scattering debris and sending a shockwave through the ground that rattled Raymond's teeth. The SUV burned where it lay, flames licking upward, consuming what seconds before had been steel and glass. Raymond set the officer down at a safe distance, checking breathing, pressing a hand to the wound at his temple with practiced efficiency. Max stood over them both, chest heaving, eyes locked on the wreckage, body angled protectively as if daring the fire to try again. As the immediate chaos settled into a harsh, flickering quiet, Raymond's gaze dropped to the officer's chest. The badge caught the firelight, reflecting it in brief, uneven flashes. The name wasn't one he recognized, and the county etched beneath it wasn't theirs. Coleman County. Bomb Squad. The words landed with weight, shifting the shape of what Raymond thought he understood about the night. Max growled again, deeper this time, head turning slightly as his nose lifted into the air. The smell of gasoline was still there, but now it carried something else beneath it. Something wrong in a way that had nothing to do with wreckage or fire. Raymond followed the line of Max's attention into the darkness beyond the burning vehicle. Toward the fog-thickened road that had gone so quiet, it felt watchful. Whatever had happened here, whatever had folded metal and stolen breath, had not finished speaking yet. The night had left a mark neither of them could name. By the time the clinic lights cut through the dark, the road felt farther away than it should have, as if distance had learned a new meaning after the fire. The building was small, practical, its windows glowing with the flat, tired brightness of a place used to holding pain without ceremony. Raymond sat still on a hard plastic chair, elbows resting on his knees, hands loosely clasped as if ready but unwilling to admit it. Max lay at his feet at first, head lifted, ears angled toward every sound that slipped through the thin walls, his body never fully at rest. Inside the treatment room, the young officer stirred. His eyelashes fluttered, breath catching unevenly, and for a brief moment, his eyes found focus. They were too young eyes for what they had just seen, still searching even as his body fought to stay present. The question came out thin, barely strong enough to shape the air, and when Raymond leaned in, he felt the weight of it settle between them like unfinished business. The answer did not come with relief, only with confusion, and then with a whisper that seemed to cost the young man more than blood ever could. The word "following" hung there, fragile and unfinished, before the officer's head fell back and the room returned to its measured beeps and practiced calm. Raymond straightened slowly, the muscles in his back tightening as old instincts tried to wake fully. He stepped aside as the nurse adjusted lines and monitors, her movements precise, eyes deliberately neutral. Max rose and began to pace the narrow hallway, tail held stiff, nails ticking softly against the floor. His nose lifted again and again toward the windows at the far end, nostrils flaring as if the night outside had followed them in. Whatever had burned on the roadside had not stayed there. Sheriff Walt arrived without announcement, filling the doorway with a presence shaped by years of carrying other people's emergencies. He was tall and broad through the shoulders, his uniform darkened by rain that had begun to fall somewhere between the wreck and town. His jaw was set hard, the skin around his eyes drawn tight in a way that spoke less of anger than of recognition. He did not rush to speak, letting the room settle around him first, as though choosing his words carefully might keep something worse from forming. When he did talk, the information landed quietly, but it changed the room all the same. A unit missing, a county that did not lose people easily, a timeline that no longer fit the simple shape of an accident. Raymond felt something shift behind his ribs, a pressure he recognized but had hoped not to feel again. Max stopped pacing, turning his head toward Walt, ears forward, as if the tone itself carried meaning. Later, when the clinic grew quieter and the night pressed closer against the windows, Raymond stood near the nurse's station while Walt spoke with a low-voiced deputy. On the counter, between them, lay a clear evidence bag, its contents small enough to be overlooked by anyone not trained to see weight where others saw size. Inside was a compact device, dark metal scarred by handling, edges too precise to belong to anything ordinary. Raymond did not touch it, but his gaze lingered, following lines and angles that felt uncomfortably familiar. Max approached, sniffed once, then turned his head away, a subtle recoil that spoke louder than a bark ever could. The explanation, when it came, was incomplete by design, an escort. Evidence moved quietly, meant to stay quiet. A partner whose name was spoken once and then not repeated, as if saying it again might make the absence harder to carry. No one filled in the gaps with theories. but the space between facts grew crowded with questions. Raymond watched Walt's face as he spoke, noting the way his eyes avoided the device for just a second too long. It was the smallest detail that shifted everything further. When the wreck report came across the desk, the words blurred together until one line held Raymond's attention. He leaned closer, tracing the description with his finger, stopping where it mentioned the vehicle's communications. Cut. Not damaged. Not burned. Severed cleanly. Away from the chaos of impact. Walt noticed the change in Raymond's posture, the way his shoulders squared as if preparing for a weight he had not yet lifted. Outside, rain finally reached town in earnest, tapping against the clinic windows in an uneven rhythm. The roads darkened, reflecting streetlights in broken lines that led nowhere. When there was nothing more to do but wait, Raymond took Max home, the drive passing in silence. The house felt different when they arrived, the porch light casting a soft circle that seemed too small for the night pressing in around it. Raymond sat on the porch steps, jacket still on, hands resting loosely against his thighs. Max settled beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched, his gaze fixed on the darkness beyond the yard. The rain carried the smell of wet earth and distant pine, a familiar comfort that did little to ease the tightness in Raymond's chest. He exhaled slowly, the sound catching before it fully escaped, and spoke not to fill the silence but to test it. "We've seen this before, haven't we?" The words barely rose above the rain, more confession than question. Max did not look at him. His attention stayed trained on the ridge beyond town, a dark line against a darker sky. His ears shifted, adjusting to something Raymond could not hear, and his body leaned forward just enough to matter. Raymond followed his line of sight, squinting into the rain, telling himself it was nothing more than memory shaping shadows. Then the light appeared. It was faint, barely there, a soft red blink near the tree line that pulsed once, twice with mechanical patience. Not lightning, not a reflection. The rain did not touch it, and the fog did not soften its edges. Raymond felt his breath slow as his mind worked to keep up, cataloging possibilities while refusing to choose one. Max rose to his feet in a single smooth motion, a low growl building in his throat, controlled and deliberate. The light blinked again, steady and waiting, and the space between fear and faith narrowed to a single point in the dark. Whatever had followed the officer had not gone far. Whatever had burned was not finished, and Max, standing rigid at Raymond's side, had already decided which way they would move next. Morning came wrapped in fog so dense it felt less like weather and more like a decision the land had made overnight. It pressed low against the ground, dulling sound and swallowing distance, leaving even familiar roads and slopes strangely untrusted. Raymond breathed it in and felt an old tension stir, the kind that did not belong to the present moment, but had never truly learned how to sleep. Max shifted his weight beside him, angling his body toward the ridge beyond town, where the red light had blinked through rain the night before, his ears fixed forward with a calm certainty that needed no command. Raymond followed that line without hesitation, his boots damp with dew, his thoughts quieter than they had been in years, while Sheriff Walt walked a measured step behind them, hands tucked into his jacket, eyes scanning the pale, shifting outline of the world, as if expecting it to change again. The climb up the ridge was slow, deliberate, and quiet enough that the fog itself seemed to listen. As they rose, the mist thinned unevenly, peeling back layer by layer until the shape ahead finally sharpened into something unmistakable. What waited just beyond the service road was not debris scattered by chance, but the burned remains of a second vehicle, stripped down to its frame, paint blistered away, metal warped into rigid curves that looked frozen mid-motion. No smoke rose now, no heat shimmered in the air. Whatever fire had lived there had finished its work carefully, leaving behind a silence that felt intentional. Raymond stopped several steps short, his chest tightening as recognition settled in without explanation. Walt exhaled once, slow and controlled, as though measuring how much of the moment he could afford to absorb without letting it settle too deeply. Max circled the wreck briefly, nose low, then shifted away from it, following a narrow line cut into the damp earth. The footprints were clear and uneven, one side dragging slightly, leading away from the burned shell toward a concrete opening half hidden by brush and runoff at the base of the slope. The drainage tunnel lay low against the hillside, its edges stained dark by years of rain and neglect, swallowing light almost as soon as it entered. Cold air spilled outward, carrying the smell of wet stone, rust, and something sharper that did not belong to the land itself. Max slowed as they approached, every movement measured now, tail held straight behind him, breath controlled, his paws echoing softly against concrete as he crossed the threshold and disappeared into the dim interior. Inside the tunnel, daylight weakened into a muted gray, broken only by thin shafts of pale light slipping through cracks above. Water dripped somewhere farther in, steady and patient, each sound marking time without urgency. Raymond felt his shoulders tighten before he realized why, his body responding to the space before memory found language for it. He flexed his hand once, then let it rest again at his side, unwilling to give the reaction more meaning than it already carried. Max slowed further, and then came to a complete stop near the tunnel wall, his posture shifting with intention rather than surprise. Resting just above a shallow stream of runoff was a compact metal case, no larger than a toolbox, its surface scuffed and dented, one corner pressed firmly into damp concrete. A faint, steady vibration hummed through it, low enough to be felt more than heard, raising the fine hairs along Raymond's arms and settling behind his eyes with quiet insistence. Raymond did not move closer immediately, choosing instead to observe the shape, the seams, the angles that felt wrong in a way that bypassed thought. Walt turned toward him, watching recognition pass across Raymond's face before it could be hidden. The fog outside the tunnel might as well have belonged to another world now, because everything had drawn inward to this single object and the memories it loosed. When Walt spoke, his voice remained low and careful, shaped less like a question than a confirmation. "You recognize it?" Raymond nodded once, the motion heavier than it should have been, his gaze fixed on details his hands had once known by heart. "I built the countermeasures for these," he said quietly, the words carrying the weight of years rather than volume. 10 years ago. The admission settled into the tunnel and stayed there, expanding the silence rather than breaking it. Walt did not press for more, but the truth widened all the same, filling the space between them. Raymond stepped closer, careful where he placed his feet, aware of Max's subtle shift into a position that placed his body squarely between Raymond and the case. The memories arrived not as a flood, but in fragments that refused to be organized. Harsh, fluorescent light reflecting off metal tables, voices bent over schematics, heat rising from distant ground where survival was measured in margins. Back then, the work had felt clean and necessary, a way to give structure to chaos, a belief that knowledge could stay ahead of destruction. He had believed in it without reservation. Max's breathing changed, pulling Raymond back into the present, shorter now and more focused, his ears adjusting as though tracking something beyond the tunnel walls. Raymond followed the line of that attention and noticed details he had missed before. The latch bore scratches that spoke of force rather than age, and along the edge of the casing, a faint marking remained where someone had tried, unsuccessfully, to erase it. The symbol struck with immediate clarity, tightening his chest as recognition settled fully. He knew that mark. He had approved it, watched crates bearing it sealed and loaded years ago at a base that no longer existed, where he had trained others to stop devices exactly like this from ending lives. This bomb had not been built recently, nor assembled by someone experimenting in the dark. It had been taken, deliberately, removed from the place where his past still lived in quiet corners, waiting. Nothing more needed to be said. Walt's silence confirmed enough. This was larger than a missing unit or a burned road, and Raymond felt the familiar weight of responsibility settle into his bones. Not as panic, but as something heavier and more enduring. Max moved away from the case and deeper into the tunnel, his pace steady and unbroken, paws splashing softly through shallow water as the passage curved upward toward a distant oval of pale light. Raymond followed, aware of his own breathing now, loud in his ears, of how narrow the space had become. Then Max barked, a single sharp sound that cracked against the concrete walls before falling away. He halted abruptly, body rigid, eyes fixed upward, and Raymond's gaze followed instinctively as his vision adjusted to the brightness beyond the tunnel mouth. Framed by fog and morning light stood a man leaning unevenly on one leg, his posture careful, deliberate, as if balance came at a cost. One hand braced against the concrete edge while the other held a small device whose shape needed no explanation. A detonator. His clothes were dark and worn, streaked with dirt and ash, his features partially obscured by the angle of the light, though his gaze locked onto Raymond with unsettling steadiness. Max stepped forward half a pace, a low growl building in his chest, restrained but unmistakable, and Raymond felt the exact moment where memory gave way to immediate danger. Whatever truth had been waiting in smoke and shadow was no longer content to remain hidden. Something had come back for him. The truth, once uncovered, refused to stay quiet. The man at the mouth of the tunnel was not a stranger shaped by chance, but a name Raymond carried from another life, one that had never fully loosened its grip. Drew Keller had once stood in clean light and ordered spaces, a technician under Raymond's command, careful with his hands, precise with his work, the kind of man who trusted systems because systems had once trusted him back. Injury had come later, followed by discharge, paperwork, silence, and the long forgetting that followed those no longer useful. Seeing him now, unsteady and hollowed by years of being unheard, felt less like confrontation and more like collision. The detonator in Drew's hand was real, its weight evident in the way his fingers curled around it, but the deeper danger lived closer to his chest. A thin wire ran beneath his jacket, disappearing into a medical monitor strapped against his ribs, its small screen blinking in steady rhythm with his heart. The device was not set to explode at a place or a time, but at a condition, waiting patiently for the one moment Drew could no longer control. If his heart failed, the countdown would finish what it had been built to do. Rain began to fall above them, first as a distant hiss against concrete and leaves, then harder, heavier, drumming against the road overhead until the sound pressed down into the tunnel itself. Water seeped along the walls and gathered at their feet, cold and insistent, carrying the smell of earth and rust. The light at the tunnel's mouth dimmed as clouds thickened, turning the outside world into a muted gray that felt smaller by the second. Raymond did not raise his weapon any higher. His hands trembled slightly, not from fear alone, but from the weight of recognition. The understanding that the man in front of him was not there to destroy for the sake of destruction. Drew's breathing was uneven, shallow where it should have been steady, each rise of his chest a negotiation rather than a given. His eyes, when they met Raymond's, held exhaustion more than rage, the kind that came from years of shouting into rooms that had already decided not to listen. The reason, when it came, arrived stripped of performance or drama, rasped out through a throat tightened by pain and rain, shaped by desperation rather than malice. Drew had not wanted bodies. He had wanted the bomb to be found, the truth dragged into light where it could no longer be ignored, because nothing else had worked. Systems had failed quietly, benefits had been cut cleanly, and the surgery his child needed had become another form letter with no one's name at the bottom. Breaking something, even himself, had seemed like the only language left. The monitor at his side began to blink faster, its rhythm no longer calm, reacting to the strain his body could no longer hide. The sound it emitted cut through the rain, sharp and insistent, an artificial echo of a heart struggling to keep pace. Max felt the change before anyone else did, a low whine escaping his throat as he stepped closer, his body angling protectively not toward Raymond alone, but toward Drew as well. He did not see an enemy. He sensed pain that had spilled beyond reason and into danger. Raymond lowered his weapon fully, letting it hang useless at his side, the choice settling into him with a quiet certainty. He spoke only once, his voice steady despite the storm pressing in, shaped by years of carrying responsibility rather than anger. Then let's end it without another name on the list. The work that followed was slow and precise, stripped of heroics, carried out in the narrow space between rain and shadow. Raymond moved closer, careful not to startle, his eyes tracking the wire, the monitor, the slight tremor in Drew's hands. Max stayed close, his breathing audible now, steady and grounding, his presence a reminder that trust could still exist in moments like this. Fingers worked carefully at connections designed to resist tampering, sweat and rain mixing at Raymond's temples as his mind slipped into an older rhythm, one that remembered how to dismantle fear one component at a time. Drew's pulse spiked suddenly, the monitor's tone sharpening into a shrill cry that filled the tunnel and drowned out the rain. His knees buckled, the detonator slipping lower as his grip weakened, and for a moment, everything threatened to collapse into chaos. Raymond's hands shook harder now, the wire resisting him as though aware of the stakes, while Max pressed closer, his shoulder brushing Raymond's leg, grounding him in the present. The seconds stretched thin, each one carrying more weight than the last. The timer on the device shifted, its numbers changing with a speed that made breath feel like a luxury. The sky above the tunnel darkened further, a distant flash of lightning turning the rain briefly red, staining the concrete walls with a color that felt like warning rather than light. Max reacted before thought could form. A single bark cut through the noise, sharp and absolute, followed by a movement so sudden it seemed born of instinct older than training. He lunged forward, jaws closing around the thin wire trailing from Drew's monitor, his body twisting as he pulled with everything he had. The connection tore free at the same instant the timer reached its final count, the sound of separation swallowed by thunder as the tunnel plunged into breathless silence. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Rain continued to fall, water continued to drip, and Drew collapsed fully to the ground, the monitor dark against his chest. Raymond's breath left him in a long, broken exhale as he dropped to one knee, one hand braced against the concrete, the other reaching instinctively for Max. The dog stood trembling but steady, eyes fixed on Raymond's face, waiting for confirmation that the world had not ended after all. Above them, the storm raged on, indifferent to how close everything had come to breaking beyond repair. In the narrow space of the tunnel, surrounded by water and shadow and the quiet aftermath of a choice made in trust, Raymond understood that survival had never been the point. Being heard had been, and tonight, for better or worse, it finally was. When the final second passed, nothing shattered the air. There was no blast, no roar, no violent answer to the tension that had wound itself tight inside the tunnel. What came instead was silence, sudden and vast, so complete that even the rain above seemed to hesitate, unsure whether it was still allowed to fall. The hum that had filled the narrow space moments earlier faded into nothing, and the small light on the device beside Drew dimmed, flickered weakly, and then went dark, as though the danger itself had finally decided to sleep. Drew lay motionless against the concrete, his chest rising just enough to prove he was still alive. The heart monitor rested quiet against his ribs now, its frantic voice reduced to a dull, steady presence that felt almost human in its restraint. Water pooled beneath him, cold and shallow, creeping along the tunnel floor as if reclaiming the space inch by inch. The world had not ended. It had simply stepped back. Raymond leaned hard against the tunnel wall, the chill seeping through his jacket as a breath tore out of him, unguarded and rough. His hands trembled now that they no longer had a task to keep them steady, and he pressed his palm briefly against the concrete, grounding himself in something solid. The weight of what had nearly happened settled slowly, not as panic, but as exhaustion so deep it felt earned. Max lowered himself beside Drew without instruction, his body angled protectively, head lifted just enough to watch every movement, every shift of air. He did not bark. He did not pace. He stayed alert and unwavering, as though guarding the fragile boundary between life and whatever waited beyond it. His presence filled the space more completely than any command ever could. Minutes later, light spilled into the tunnel in narrow beams as footsteps echoed from above. Sheriff Walt's team arrived carefully, voices low, movements deliberate, the kind of restraint learned only by people who understood how easily chaos could be reignited. Faces appeared pale in the artificial glow, eyes moving first to the darkened device, then to Drew, then finally to Max, who did not yield his position until the danger was fully understood. No one rushed forward. No one spoke over the moment. The silence that had followed the non-explosion seemed to demand respect. When the question came, it was quiet, almost hesitant, as if even words felt intrusive now. "Bomb defused?" Raymond answered without lifting his head, his gaze still resting on Max, who had not moved. "By instinct." The paramedics approached slowly, reading the room before touching it, hands steady as they checked Drew's pulse and secured the monitor. Only when they were certain did Max rise, stepping back just enough to allow them space, his eyes never leaving Drew's face. The stretcher slid beneath him, rain streaking across the fabric as Drew was lifted and carried out into the gray light above, alive but emptied, his story far from finished. There was no celebration, no relief loud enough to break the spell. What remained was the heavy knowledge of how close everything had come to breaking beyond repair. In the days that followed, the truth emerged the way smoke does after a fire, slowly, reluctantly, and impossible to ignore once it spread. Reports filled in the gaps left by the night. The missing bomb unit, the second vehicle, the severed radio wire, the deliberate trail meant not to escape, but to be found. Each piece aligned with unsettling clarity, leading back to a single name and a single failure that no one could pretend belonged to chance. Drew Keller's story moved through the county not as a headline meant for outrage, but as a mirror held too close for comfort. The injury that ended his service, the discharge that came with quiet finality, the benefits reduced to forms and waiting periods, letters returned unanswered, while a child's surgery grew more urgent with every passing month. It was not a story of villainy. It was a record of neglect written in the margins of policy and procedure. Raymond followed the coverage from a distance, not because he wanted to relive it, but because he recognized the language being spoken. He had seen it before, in different places, under harsher skies, when people learned that the only way to be heard was to break something loudly enough that silence could no longer hold. Understanding did not excuse the risk Drew had taken, but it gave it shape, and shape mattered. Officer Ryan recovered slowly but steadily, his youth doing what experience alone could not. When he finally returned to the station, his movements were careful, as though the world had earned his caution. He paused near the doorway, taking in the familiar smell of coffee and paperwork, the ordinary details that felt noticeworthy now, before his eyes found Raymond and Max together near the far wall. Ryan spoke quietly, his voice carrying disbelief more than fear as he tried to describe the night, the way he never even saw the explosion coming, the way consciousness had slipped away before understanding ever arrived. Raymond listened without interruption, then answered with a calm certainty that settled the room. "You weren't supposed to," he said. "You just had to live long enough to see what loyalty looks like." Ryan's gaze shifted to Max, who sat at Raymond's side without ceremony, ears relaxed, posture unassuming, as if nothing about him required explanation. The young officer swallowed hard and nodded once, his hand brushing unconsciously against his badge, grounding himself in its weight. That night, when the house finally grew quiet and the rain had moved on to other roads, Raymond sat on the edge of the bed and watched Max sleep. The dog's chest rose and fell slowly, evenly, each breath steady enough to pull Raymond's own breathing into sync. One ear twitched now and then, chasing dreams Raymond did not try to imagine, and a faint scar along Max's flank caught the lamplight, a reminder of other nights when instinct had stepped in where reason could not. Raymond leaned forward, forearms resting on his knees, the weight of the day settling gently rather than pressing down. His voice stayed low, meant only for the space between them. "You knew when to pull," he murmured, watching the quiet rise of Max's chest, "and when to stay." Max did not stir. He did not need to. His presence answered more completely than words ever could. Outside, the storm clouds finally broke apart, letting moonlight spill across the empty street. The fire that had threatened to consume everything was gone now, leaving behind clarity instead of ash. Some truths had finally been seen. Some lives had been spared. And in the stillness that followed, Raymond understood that healing rarely arrived with noise or applause. It came softly, after the danger had passed, carried by loyalty that understood the difference between action and patience, and honored both. What remained after the danger passed was not noise, nor relief loud enough to announce itself, but a quieter kind of remembering that settled slowly into place. The nights no longer carried urgency, and the days no longer felt like questions waiting for answers. What lingered was the steady awareness that something fragile had survived, and that survival itself had altered the shape of everything that followed. Spring arrived without ceremony. Snow withdrew first from the roads, then from the low branches, then finally from the shaded ground beneath the pines, where winter had held on longest. Meltwater traced thin paths through soil still dark from cold, carrying with it the last weight of the season. Raymond noticed these changes the way a man notices his own breathing after a long illness, cautiously at first, then with quiet gratitude as each sign confirmed that the world was still willing to move forward. The stretch of road where the patrol SUV had burned no longer carried the smell of smoke. Fresh gravel lined the shoulder. The ditch reshaped until it blended once more into the land, its edges softened by grass that had already begun to reclaim what fire once claimed. Cars passed now without slowing, their tires humming evenly against the pavement, unaware of how close the place had once come to holding something irreversible. Raymond stood there one morning with Max at his side, hands resting loosely in his jacket pockets, letting the ordinary sound of passing traffic wash over him. Max moved calmly through the grass, nose low, tail relaxed, as though the land itself had finished telling its story and no longer needed guarding. Where metal had twisted and blackened, green pushed through again, stubborn and patient, life returning without asking permission. Raymond watched the dog trace those quiet lines and felt something ease in his chest, a tension he had carried so long it had almost felt permanent. Officer Ryan arrived later that day, walking on his own strength, his movements careful but sure. He wore no uniform, no equipment pressed sharp for duty, only a simple jacket against the lingering chill. In his hand, he carried a single polished badge, its surface catching the pale light as he turned it over once, as if weighing the meaning it now held. When he knelt near the edge of the road, he placed the badge gently against the earth, not as an offering, but as acknowledgement. The moment did not ask for attention. It asked for stillness. Raymond stood a few steps back, Max beside him, and allowed the silence to hold. Ryan bowed his head briefly, not in grief, but in recognition of how close everything had come to ending differently. When he rose, his expression carried something steadier than before, a kind of calm that did not erase memory but made space for it. No words were exchanged, none were necessary. Farther away, beyond the low hills and thinning trees, Drew Keller's daughter stood at the county memorial with Sheriff Walt beside her. Wildflowers filled her small hands, bright against the gray stone, their colors too alive to ignore. She placed them carefully, one by one, her movements deliberate, as though each stem carried something she was not ready to say aloud. Walt removed his hat and held it against his chest, his posture unguarded, his gaze fixed not on the name etched into stone, but on the child standing before it. The scene did not demand judgment. It did not ask for forgiveness or offer explanations. It simply existed, a quiet acknowledgement of loss and survival standing side by side. Life resumed its shape slowly, without insisting that everything return to what it had been before. Drew remained in recovery, his body healing in measured increments, his story no longer buried beneath paperwork and closed doors. Conversations changed tone across the county, not loudly, but noticeably. Questions lingered where dismissal once lived, and listening replaced certainty in places where certainty had done harm. Raymond did not follow every update. He did not need to. Knowing that the silence had finally been broken was enough. As evening settled, he returned to the edge of town where the forest began, drawn there not by duty, but by habit shaped into something gentler. Snow still clung to the ground beneath the tallest pines, thin and translucent now, melting into dark earth with a patience that felt earned. Light filtered through branches overhead, catching on bark and stone, turning the clearing into something almost reverent in its simplicity. Raymond sat on the hood of his truck and let his legs dangle, the metal warm beneath him from the day's sun. The air carried the scent of wet soil and pine sap, clean and grounding. Max settled beside him, leaning his weight gently against Raymond's knee, not asking for attention, not waiting for instruction, simply present in the way that mattered most. The dog's breathing was slow and even, his body relaxed in a way that spoke of trust earned rather than assumed. A faint scar along his flank caught the light as he shifted slightly, a reminder of other nights and other choices that had shaped them both. Raymond rested his hand briefly on Max's shoulder, feeling the solid warmth there, the quiet strength that had carried them through moments when certainty had been scarce. He did not speak. Words felt unnecessary now, smaller than the moment allowed. The wind moved softly through the trees, carrying with it the sound of water somewhere below, freed at last from ice. The forest breathed in slow, steady rhythms, unconcerned with human timelines or conclusions. As dusk deepened, the sky softened into muted blues and golds, and the first stars appeared, faint at first, then steadier as darkness settled in. Raymond watched them without urgency, aware of time passing but no longer pressed by it. The past had not vanished. It never would. But it had loosened its grip, making room for something, quieter to remain. Max shifted slightly, pressing closer, his head resting against Raymond's leg as if confirming that this, too, was work worth doing. The road behind them lay repaired and unremarkable, carrying no memory of fire unless someone chose to remember. Ahead, the forest stood patient and enduring, offering no promises beyond continuity. Raymond stayed where he was as night fully arrived, letting the stillness gather around them. For the first time in a long while, the quiet did not feel empty. It felt earned. And in that quiet, with Max beside him and the world slowly exhaling, Raymond understood that some endings do not close with certainty or triumph. They remain open, gentle, and sufficient, like a breath taken without fear, held just long enough to know that healing has already begun. When this story comes to a close, what lingers is not the danger that once filled the night, but the quiet truth it revealed. A life was saved not by force, but by trust. A broken path was redirected not by anger, but by loyalty that knew when to act and when to remain. In the space where fear once lived, understanding slowly took its place, and what seemed lost found a way to be seen again. The lesson left behind is a gentle one. Courage does not always roar. Sometimes it kneels, waits, listens, and chooses compassion when judgment would be easier. Loyalty is not proven in grand gestures, but in the moments when no one is watching, when staying is harder than leaving. And healing, real healing, rarely arrives all at once. It grows quietly, carried by kindness, patience, and the willingness to see one another fully. If this story stayed with you, if it brought a moment of calm or reflection to your day, you're always welcome to stay connected. By subscribing to the channel, you'll find more quiet stories like this. Stories of loyalty, second chances, and the hope that remains even after the hardest nights.